Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now last time I talked about despised films that are hated by critics and audiences, but which I happen to love. And at the end of that video, I promised you I would do the opposite. I would talk about beloved films that critics and audiences gush over and adore, and that I really can't stand. They really get on my tits. Now, I'm aware that this video might upset people, it might trigger people. You might hear about a film that you love being slagged off. It's only a bit of fun, it's only intended to get the conversation going, and you can always take revenge on me in the comments below. I'm going to kick off with Love Actually, that dreadful Richard Curtis film. You know the one where Hugh Grant plays a Tony Blair lookalike who fancies his secretary, and he's dancing around number 10 Downing Street in a very embarrassing dance sequence, which is supposed to be hilarious. I hate this film. I absolutely loathe it. Now, I must admit there are two strikes against this film for me on a personal level. The first is I had to work on it. I had to subtitle it for cinema release. Now, when you subtitle something, you work on it at length. You have to keep going back, editing it, keep going back and watch it over and over again. So I watched it a lot. And then, secondly, I remember vividly about a year after it came out, I was out with some friends and having a drink. And the conversation was this. The conversation was, what's your favourite story in Love Actually? And I sort of froze and I thought, I didn't like any of it. But all these people around me were going, oh, I like this bit, and I like that story, and I thought this story. And it came to me and I said, well, Emma Thompson, because she's the only person who acted in the entire film. The table went silent. I wasn't going home with a girl that night. So I have terrible memories of this film. I absolutely hate this movie with a passion. I had this Italian work colleague of mine who told me that in Europe now they have Love Actually and Prosecco nights, where these young people, they go, they dress up, they glam up, they have a glass of Prosecco, and they sit down and watch Love Actually. That is what is happening in my third circle of hell. I absolutely loathe this film. But that's what happens when you get older, when you get to around my age. You know, I'm 51 years of age now. And what happens to you is, you know, you go through life and there's these films that are summer blockbusters or films that you've seen and you forget. And then years later, some young person tells you, this is a classic. And you think, when did this film become a classic? When did Ghostbusters become a classic? I went to see Ghostbusters. I enjoyed the single. I had the single when I was about 12 years old. But somewhere along the line, it became a really important film. When did that happen? I remember one Christmas at work. We were coming up to Christmas, you know, and there was Christmas spirit in the air. And someone said, "Oh, let's just put on the TV in the background and have a Christmas movie in the background. You know, something like Wizard of Oz or It's a Wonderful Life or whatever." And one of them piped up and said, "Oh, look, Jumanji. That's a classic." Jumanji? When the hell did Jumanji become a classic? Oh my God. So I want to look at 5 films now, 5 popular movies that somewhere along the line became classics and no one told me. First of all, when I was 13 years of age, 1985, out came Back to the Future. Do you remember Back to the Future, you know, with Michael J. Fox and the DeLorean and that guy from Taxi who's the mad scientist? Apparently, this is a great piece of cinema. I've actually met someone who says this is their favourite film of all time. I remember at the time I was a young teenager and I was supposed to like Michael J. Fox. There was this film, was it The Secret of My Success, where Michael J. Fox was supposed to be wonderful and hilarious. I sat there thinking, who is this preppy looking little git and why am I supposed to like him? Why don't you just take him away? But unfortunately, I was wrong and he became famous and he was in Back to the Future, a film where he's so wonderful that even his own mum starts fancying him. Oh my God. But apparently this is a classic. A few years later and we get Die Hard. I actually had a friend of mine who said that if I said I didn't like Die Hard, he would remove his subscription. I hope he doesn't. But, you know, I have to live in a universe where this is now regarded as a Christmas film. When did Die Hard become a Christmas film? This is a film in which we have to watch Bruce Willis, of all people, being smug, as he usually is, in his vest, covered in Vaseline, running around a tower. All I can say is every time I've seen this film, which is about twice because I can't sit through it anymore, is I'm completely on Alan Rickman's side, and I want that tower to blow up. That's all I can say. The next year, 1991, I was at university, and so I went on film trips with my mates to the cinema. There were two films that came out this year that are now modern classics, and we all have to like them. The first is Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park. How could this film fail? It was made by Steven Spielberg, and it's got dinosaurs in it. It should be a masterpiece, and everyone treated it as a masterpiece. I thought it was crap. I thought that Spielberg really dropped the ball. It was nowhere near as good as his early successes like Jaws and E.T. and Raiders. And I think he got the cast wrong. They were all good actors, but they weren't right for the part. They weren't right for an action movie. They seemed to be muddled and underwritten. You had Richard Attenborough and Laura Dern and Bob Peck and, what's his face, Jeff Goldblum. But they seemed to be underwritten characters. I couldn't warm to any of them. I found the storyline dull. Yet, this is one of the major films of all time, apparently. In the same year, I think the film that won the Oscar that year, actually, is The Silence of the Lambs. I remember going to see this as a student with my friends, and everyone's sitting there. This was this great movie with Anthony Hopkins' great performance. And I was sitting there thinking, this is a load of crap. It's a load of turkey twaddle. It's absolute nonsense. Hopkins was this great actor through the 70s and 80s, and this was his apotheosis, apparently. It wasn't. It was the moment where he sold out, really, and started giving rather barnstorming, rather hammy performances, in my opinion. The whole film is so sensationalist in its style. At the time, I much preferred Manhunter, which has the same Hannibal Lecter character in it, played by Brian Cox. I'm not so sure about Manhunter these days. I've gone off it a bit. But I much preferred it at the time to Silence of the Lambs. A few years later, another film came out that became this kind of instant popular classic. And I was sitting there thinking, what? You know what I'm going to talk about. The Shawshank Redemption. You know, that dreadfully, portentously well-meaning film where Morgan Freeman has this, this voice that goes, Andy did this and Andy did that. I don't give a toss what Andy did. He gets on my nerves. And, it's Tim Robbins. Andy is Tim Robbins. We're supposed to like Tim Robbins. I never did. Supposedly, he was okay in Jacob's Ladder. But, in any other film, come on, you're against Tim Robbins all the time, aren't you? Oh, that's just me. I just thought The Shawshank Redemption is a supposedly gritty prison drama for families, really. People who don't really want to see the reality of prison and how it affects people, but some kind of fantasy of gritty prison drama, with a rather cloying sort of Christian allegory underneath it all, which I found very difficult to take. So those are some popular classics that grisly old me doesn't really like. But in case people think I've got it in for mainstream movies, I thought I'd also look at some art house classics, which I really don't get on with at all. Top of the list, let's take something that's really famous. Abu de Souffle, or Breathless, the first great film apparently, by Jean-Luc Godard. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I am not a fan of Godard. And it starts right here. I remember when I saw this film, I was charmed by Gene Seberg, but the rest of the film got on my nerves. I didn't find it breezy and youthful and fun. I found it annoying. What fascinates me about Godard is it's here where film first becomes self-reflexive and meta and ironic. I think, it's Jonathan Rosenbaum who said that more than being a sort of narrative film director, Godard is a critic, and his films are actually works of film criticism, and they are. They're very self-aware. They're sort of, instead of a camera pointing out at life, they're a camera pointing inwards at cinema. And I don't want that. And, so the games that Godard plays with jump cuts and so on are almost plays of looking at cinema and how cinema works. And so everything becomes sort of in that postmodern sense of we're not just watching two people walking down the street, we're watching how two people walk down the street and playing with how we've already seen that in movies. And this is what leads over the years to the more meta cinema, or say someone like Tarantino. It always amuses me that a lot of people who love Godard hate Tarantino, whereas in fact he's kind of like the end result of what you're going to bring into cinema if you bring in Godard's critical, sort of insular, inward-looking idea of playing with cinema. Oh well. Then later on in the 60s, Il Gattopardo, or The Leopard. Now, everything about this film on paper would suggest that it's a beautiful work of art. It's based on a great Italian novel by Lampedusa. It's an Italian classic. It's this epic story starring Burt Lancaster and Claudio Cardinale, two of my favourite actors. All very beautifully choreographed and filmed by Visconti. This should be a masterpiece. I find it hellishly boring. God, it's boring. I was speaking to a friend of mine recently, and he said the same thing. He and some friends sat down one Christmas to watch it, and by about an hour and a half in, they were all sort of like, I really should like this film. I feel terrible about not liking it, but God, it bores me to tears, like a lot of Visconti. Like Death in Venice is the same. I don't know what it is. Something about Visconti. Another director and art film that I don't get on with is the Polish director Krzysztof Kieślowski, who's kind of like one of the holy gods of art house cinema. But I think his films show up those things that people don't like about art house cinema. This kind of portentous seriousness that is actually masking very little content. I remember that the British critic Gilbert Adair, who was a critic I admired very much, one of the most liberating things I ever read in film criticism was when, in an aside, he was talking about another movie, but he said, as someone who happens to think that Three Colours Blue is the most imbecilic film I've ever seen. And I almost cheered when I read that, because I felt that these Three Colours films by Krzysztof Kieślowski were so overrated. And the fact that Adair could call them the most imbecilic film, even in an aside when he was talking about another film, was kind of liberating. And I felt this when I watched the third in the trilogy, Three Colours Red. And I was sitting there with some friends watching it. And it's called Red, right? And the whole start of the film is all about red things. There's a traffic light, that's red. And she's wearing a red dress and she's got red lipstick on. What else is red? Maybe a post box. Ooh, what else can you think of that's red? And there was all these red things, and it was almost insulting, really. I was kind of giggling to myself, and everyone else was very serious, And I couldn't get into the movie after that point. I thought, what is this? Some kind of children's thing? Now, come on, people. What else can you think of that's red? I'm probably underselling this film, but I've always had that slight sense of ridiculousness about Kieślowski's portentous approach to directing. Perhaps I'm being a bit heretical there. Another film that I saw again recently, I feel really bad about this one. I genuinely feel awful about it because I know it's an important piece of cinema. And one of my own regular subscribers here recommended it as one of their favourite films. And I thought, I've got to try this again on their recommendation. And I watched it again this week. And oh my God, it's a film I struggle with. And that is Jacques Tati's Playtime. Jacques Tati went to enormous lengths with this film. He even built this kind of mini city on the outskirts of Paris so that he could construct these elaborate gags. And the whole way the film works is it's Monsieur Hulot trapped in this city of glass and steel and reflections. And there are all sorts of different sight gags being set up in depth. And what happens is that because it's such a complex, almost ballet construction, there's all sorts of different gags going on at different parts of the screen. And this has been celebrated by many critics as being, a democratic kind of cinema where your eye isn't trained, your eye is free and liberal to go everywhere. Yes, that's true. It doesn't make it very enjoyable to watch, though, for 2 hours. I mean, after 2 hours of slogging through one little gag here and one little gag there, and then one little gag here and one little gag there, I'm straining at the leash. I want out. I think that Tati's kind of light, sort of almost childish humour gets on my nerves after a while. I struggle with this film. I know that many people admire it, but I don't think I could sit through it again. I'll leave it there. I don't want to get people too angry. So those are some films, beloved films, that I just can't get my head round. I didn't want to go too far. There were loads of other films that I wanted to choose, but I thought I would do the right thing and not have a go at another piece of unsuspecting pulp fiction.